Good morning. Page 293. The obvious first objective was to capture the service yard in which all the camp's food stores were also situated. They began the operation in the afternoon of a non-working day, Sunday, May 16, 1954. First, the mobiles climbed onto the roofs of their huts and perched at intervals along the wall between Camp Divisions 2 and 3. Then, at the command of their leaders, who stayed up aloft, they jumped down into Camp Division number 2 with sticks in their hands, formed up a column, and marched in line along the central road. This ran along the axis of number 2, right up to the inner gates of the service yard, which brought them to a halt. All these quite undistinguished operations took a certain time, during which the warders managed to get themselves organized and obtain instructions. And here is something extremely interesting. The warders started running around the huts of the 58s, appealing to these men whom they had treated like dirt for 35 years. Look out, lads, the thieves are on their way to break into the women's camp. They are going to rape your wives and daughters. Come and help us. Let's stop them at it. But a treaty is a treaty, and those who, not knowing about it, seemed eager to follow the bosses were stopped. Normally, the 58s would have risen to this bait, but this time the warders found no helpers among them. Just how the warders would have defended the women's camp against their favorites, no one knows. But first they had to think of defending the storerooms around the service yard. The gates of the service yard were flung open, and a platoon of unarmed soldiers came out to meet the attackers, with Belia, the ward, leading them from behind. Perhaps devotion to duty had kept him inside the camp on a Sunday out of zeal, or perhaps he was officer of the day. The soldiers started pushing the mobiles away and broke their lines without resorting to their clubs. The thieves began retreating to their own Camp Division number 3, scaling the wall once again, from which the rear guard were covered their retreat by throwing stones and mud bricks at the soldiers. No thief, of course, was arrested as a result of this. The authorities still saw it as nothing but high-spirited mischief and let the camp Sunday quietly run its course. Dinner was handed around without incident, and in the evening, as soon as it was dark, they started showing a film, Rimsky-Korsakov, using a space near the mess hall as an open-air cinema. Before the gallant composer could withdraw from the conservatory in protest against oppression and persecution, the tinkle of broken glass could be heard from the lamps around the boundary zone. The mobiles were shooting at them from slingshots to put out the lights over the camp area. They swarmed all over Camp Division number 2 in the darkness, and their shrill bandit whistles rent the air. They broke the service yard gate down with a beam, and from there made breach in the wall with a section of railway line, and were through to the women's camp. There were also some of the younger 58s with them. In the light of the flares fired from the towers, our friend Captain Belyayev, the security officer, broke into the service yard from outside the camp, through the guardhouse with a platoon of Tommy gunners, and for the first time in the history of Gulag, opened fire on the class allies. Some were killed and dozens wounded. Behind them came red tabs to bayonet the wounded. Behind them again, observing the usual division of punitive labor, already adopted in Ekabatsus, in Norilsk, and in Vorkuta, ran warders with iron crowbars, and with these they battered the wounded to death. The night the lights went up in the operating room, and the hospital camp and Camp Division No. 2, and Fuster, the surgeon, a Spanish prisoner, went to work. The service yard was now firmly held by the punitive forces, and machine gunners were posted there, but the 2nd Camp Division, the mobiles, had played their overture, and the politicals now came onto the stage, erected a barricade facing the service yard gate. The 2nd and 3rd Camp Divisions had been joined together by a hole in the wall, and there were no longer any warders, any MVD authority in them. But what of those who had succeeded in breaking through to the women's camp and were cut off there now? Events outsoared the casual contempt which the thieves feel for females. When shots rang out in the service yard, those who had broken into the women's camp ceased to be greedy predators and became comrades in misfortune. The women hid them. Unarmed soldiers came in to catch them, then others with guns. The women got in the way of the searchers and resisted attempts to move them. The soldiers punched the women and struck them with their gun butts, dragged some of them off to jail. Thanks to someone's foresight, there was a jailhouse in the women's camp area, and shot at some of the men. Finding its punitive force under strength, the command brought into the women's camp some black tabs, soldiers from a construction battalion stationed in Kengir. But they would have nothing to do with this unsoldierly work and had to be taken away. At the same time, here in the women's camp was the best political excuse which the executioners could offer their superiors in self-defense. They were not all stupid. Whether they had read something of the sort or thought of it for themselves, on Monday they led photographers into the women's camp, together with 2 or 3 of their own apes, disguised as prisoners. The impostors started pulling women about, while the photographers took pictures. Obviously, it was to save defenseless women from such bullying. The Captain Belyaev had been compelled to open fire. In the morning hours on Monday, there was growing tensions on both sides of the barricade and the broken gates to the service yard. The yard had not been cleared of bodies. Machine gunners lay at their guns, which were trained on the gate. In the liberated men's camps, they were breaking bunks to arm themselves and making shields out of boards and mattresses. Prisoners shouted across the barricades at the butchers, who shouted back. Something had to give. The position was far too precarious. The Czechs on the barricade were thinking of taking the offensive themselves. Some emaciated men took their shirts off, got up on the barricade, pointed their bony chests and ribs, and shouted to the machine gunners, "Come on then, shoot, strike down your fathers, finish us off." Suddenly a soldier ran into the yard with a note for the officer. The officer gave orders for the bodies to be taken up, and the red tabs left the yard with them. For 5 minutes the barricade was silent and mistrustful. Then the first Czechs peeped cautiously into the yard. It was empty except for the black prison caps lying around. Dead men's caps, with stitched on numbered patches. They discovered later that the order to clear the yard had been given by the Minister of Internal Affairs of the Kazakh Republic, who had just flown in from Alma-Ata. The bodies carried away were driven out onto the steppe and buried, to rule out post-mortem examination if someone later called for it. Shouts of hurrah went through the ranks. They poured into the yard, and into the women's camp. They enlarged the breach, then they freed the women in the jailhouse, and the whole camp was united. The whole of the main camp area was free. Only number 4 division, the camp jail, was left. There were, there were 4 red-tabbed sentries on every tower, no lack of ears to cram with insults. Prisoners stood facing the towers and shouted at them. The women, naturally louder than anyone, "You're worse than fascists, bloodsuckers, murderers." A priest or two were of course easily found in the camp, and there, in a morgue, a requiem was sung for those who had been killed or died later from their wounds. How can we say what feelings wrung the hearts of those 8,000 men who for so long, until yesterday, had been slaves with no sense of fellowship, and now had united and freed themselves, not fully perhaps, but at least within the rectangle of those walls, and under the gaze of those quadrupled guards. Even the bedridden fast in locked huts at Ekibatsus was felt as a moment of contact with freedom. This now was the February Revolution. So long suppressed, the brotherhood of man had broken through at last. We loved the thieves, and the thieves loved us. There was no getting away from it. They had sealed their friendship in blood. They had departed from their code. Still more, of course, we loved the women, and now we were living as human beings should. There were women at our side once more, and they were our sisters, and shared our fate. Proclamations appeared in the mess hall. Arm yourselves as best you can and attack the soldiers first, the most passionate among them. Hastily scrawled their slogans on scraps of newspaper. There was no other paper. In black or colored letters, bash the Czechist boys. Death to the stoolies, the Czechist stooges. Here, there, everywhere you turned, there were meetings and orators. Everybody had suggestions of his own. Come on, think. You're permitted to think now. Who gets your vote? What demands shall we put forward? What is it we want? Put Belyayev on trial. That's understood. Put the murderers on trial. Goes without saying. What else? No locking huts. Take the numbers off. But beyond that came the most frightening thing, the real reason why they had started it all, what they really wanted. We want freedom, of course, just freedom, but who can give it to us? The judges who condemned us in Moscow? As long as our complaints are against Stepleg or Karaganda, they will go on talking to us. But if we start complaining against Moscow, we'll all be buried in this steppe. Well then, what do we want? To break holes in the walls? To run off into the wilderness? Those hours of freedom, immense chains had fallen from our arms and shoulders. No, whatever happened, there could be no regrets. That one day made it all worthwhile. Late on Monday, a delegation from Command HQ arrived in the seething camp. The delegation was quite well disposed. They did not glare savagely at the prisoners. They had no Tommy gunners with them. No one would ever take them for henchmen of the Bloody Beria. Arsad learned that generals had flown in from Moscow, Bochkov from Gulag headquarters, and the deputy procurator general Vavilov. They had served in various times, but why reopen old wounds? They found the prisoners' demands fully justified. We simply gasped. Justified? We aren't rebels, then. No, they're quite justified. Those responsible for the shooting will be made to answer for it. But why did they beat up women? Beat up women? The delegation was shocked. That can't be true. Anya Mikhalovich brought in a succession of battered women for them to see. The commission was deeply moved. We look into it, never fear. Beasts, Lupia Bershevskaya, said the general. There were other shouts. No locks on huts. We won't lock them anymore. Take the numbers off. Certainly we'll take them off. Comes the assurances from a general whom the prisoners had never laid eyes on and would never see again. The holes in the wall between camp areas must remain. They were getting bolder. We must be allowed to mix with each other. All right, mix as much as you like. The general agreed. Let the holes remain. Right, brothers, what else do we want? We've won. We raised hell for just one day, enjoyed ourselves, let off steam, and we won. Although some among us shake their heads and say, it's a trick. It's all a trick. We believe it. We believe our bosses. They're not so bad. On the whole, we believe because that's our easiest way out of this situation. All that the downtrodden can do is go on hoping. After every disappointment, they must find fresh reason for hope. So, on Tuesday, May 18th, all the Kengir camp divisions went out to work, reconciling themselves to thoughts of their dead. That morning, the whole affair could still have ended quietly, but the exalted generals assembled in Kengir would have considered such an outcome a defeat for themselves. They could not seriously admit that prisoners were in the right. They could not seriously punish soldiers of the MPD. Their mean understanding could draw only one moral. The walls between camp divisions were not strong enough. They must ring them with hoops of fire. And that day the zealous commanders harnessed for work people who had lost the habit years or decades ago. Officers and warders donned aprons. Those who knew how to handle them took up trowels. Soldiers released from the towers wheeled barrels and carried hobs. Discharged soldiers who had stayed around the camps hauled and handed up mud bricks. And by evening, the breaches were bricked up. The broken lamps were replaced. Prohibited zones had been marked along inside walls, and sentries posted at the ends with orders to fire. When the columns of prisoners returned to camp in the evening, after giving a day's work to the state, they were hurried in to supper before they knew what was happening, so that they could be locked up quickly. On orders from the general, the jailers had to play for time that evening of blatant dishonesty after yesterday's promises. Later on, the prisoners would get used to it and slip back into the rut. But before nightfall, the long-drawn whistles heard on Sunday shrilled through the camp again. The 2nd and 3rd camp divisions were calling each other like hooligans on a spree. These whistles were another useful contribution from the thieves to the common cause. The warders took fright and fled from the campgrounds without finishing their duties. Only one officer slipped up, Medvedev, a first lieutenant in the quartermaster's service, stayed behind to finish his business and was held prisoner till morning. The camp was in the hands of the Zeks, but they were divided. The towers opened fire with machine guns on anyone who approached the inside walls. They killed several and wounded several. Once again, Zeks broke all the lamps with slingshots, but the towers lit up the camp with flares. This was where the 2nd Camp Division found a use for the quartermaster. They tied him up with one of his epaulets torn off to a table and pushed it up to the strip near the boundary fence, with him yelling to his people, "Don't shoot, it's me. This is me, don't shoot." They battered at the barbed wire and the new fence posts with long tables, but it was impossible, under fire, either to break through the barrier or to climb over it, so they had to burrow under. As always, there were no shovels, except those for use in case of fire inside the camp. Kitchen knives and mess tins were put into service. That night, May 18th to 19th, they burrowed under all the walls and again united all the divisions and the service yard. The towers had stopped shooting now. There were plenty of tools in the service yard. The whole daytime work of the athletic masons had gone to waste. Under cover of night, they broke down the boundary fences, knocked holes in the walls, and widened the passages so that they would not become traps. In the next few days, they made them 20 meters wide. The same night, they broke through the wall around the 4th Camp Division, the prison area, too. The warders guarding the jails fled, some to the guardhouse, some to the towers, where the ladders were let down for them. The prisoners wrecked the interrogation offices. Among those released from jail were those who on the morrow would take command of the rising. Former Red Army Colonel Captain Kuznetsov, a graduate of the Fruns Academy, no longer young. After the war, he had commanded a regiment in Germany, and one of his men had run away to the western part. This was why he had been imprisoned. He was in the camp jail for slanderous accounts of camp life in letters sent out through free workers. And former First Lieutenant Gleb Slushenkov. He had been a prisoner of war, and some said a Vlasovite. In the new jailhouse were some inhabitants of the Kengir settlement, minor offenders. At first they thought that nationwide revolution had broke out and rejoiced in their unexpected freedom, but they quickly discovered that the revolution was too localized, and the minor offenders loyally returned to their stone sack and dutifully lived there without guards through the rebellion, though they did go to eat in the mutinous sects mess hall. Mutinous sects who 3 times already had tried to reject this mutiny and this freedom. They did not know how to treat such gifts and feared rather than desired them. But a force as restless as the surf breaking on the shore had carried them helplessly into this rebellion. What else could they do? Put their faith in promises? They would be cheated again, as the slave masters had shown so clearly the day before, and so often in the past. So, should they kneel in submission? They had spent years on their knees and earned no clemency. Should they give themselves up and take their punishment today? Today, or after a month of freedom, punishment would be equally cruel at the hands of those whose courts functioned like clockwork. If quarters were given out, it would be all around, with no one left out. The runaway escapes to enjoy just one day of freedom. In the same way, these 8,000 men had not so much raised a rebellion as escaped to freedom, though not for long. 8,000 men, from being slaves, had suddenly become free, and now was their chance to live. Faces usually grim softened into kind smiles. Women looked at men, and men took them by the hand. Some who had corresponded by ingenious secret ways without ever seeing each other met at last. Lithuanian girls, whose weddings had been solemnized by priests on the other side of the wall, now saw their lawful wedded husbands for the first time. The Lord had sent down to earth the marriages made in heaven. For the first time in their lives, no one tried to prevent the sectarians and believers from meeting for prayer. Foreigners scattered about the camp divisions now found each other and talked about this strange Asiatic revolution in their own languages. The camp's food supply was in the hands of the prisoners. No one drove them out to work line-up, and an 11-hour workday. The morning of May 19th dawned over a feverishly sleepless camp, which had torn off its number patches. Posts with broken lamps sprawled against the wire fences. Even without their help, the Czechs moved freely from zone to zone by the trenches dug under the wires. Many of them took their street clothes from the storerooms and put them on. Some of the Some of the lads crammed fur hats on their heads. Shortly there would be embroidered shirts, and on the Central Asians, bright-colored robes and turbans. The gray-black camp would be a blaze of color. Orderlies went around the huts, summoning us to the big mess hall to elect a commission for negotiations with the authorities and for self-government, as it modestly and timidly described itself. For all they knew, they were electing it just for a few hours, but it was destined to become the government of Kengir camp for 40 days. Sorry, I think I might have to stop there. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good day. I appreciate you. If anyone's there. It's okay.